Tonight's file gathers 3 real incidents people still file under one phrase. Someone's outside. They're not legends. Each came from a recorded report. Each happened to someone who thought the dark was empty. Drop your city and local time in the comments and add what you're listening on, so our little night map can circle the world. If this keeps you company, wait until the video ends to subscribe, then tap the bell so the next file finds you. This first story begins with a house that should have been quiet, but quiet has memory, and sometimes it knocks back. The house sat with its back to the county road, a rectangle of peeling white paint and sagging porch, a place the realtor had described politely as quaint, and the couple had, at first, quietly loved. They signed the papers on a Tuesday in late October 1977. The air smelled of cold leaves and wood smoke. They brought in lamps and an old rug, 2 boxed record players, and a little potted fern that refused to take to the kitchen window. It was exactly the kind of house people imagined when they thought about winding down, the kind of house that made sense for leaving a life of loud city things behind. Neighbours waved when they unloaded. The nearest neighbour was a widow who kept hens and a radio tuned to daytime talk shows. The county sheriff's office was a 20-minute drive if the weather held. On the first night, the couple sat on the floor with a lamp between them, and the house made ordinary settling noises, pipes, a board contracting, a fox calling somewhere past the trees. They felt entirely private, a single island of warmth in a large, indifferent dark. The knocking began on the 4th night. It arrived at first as a curiosity. A single 3-rap cadence at the back door, precise and soft, as if someone had learned the wood's pitch and been careful not to wake the sleeping house. They assumed it was a trick of the wind until the 2nd night, when the knock repeated at exactly the same minute. 2:13 a.m. The 3rd evening they set a recorder beneath the kitchen table, a token of amusement and a small attempt at proof. When the sound came, one of them kept their hand pressed to the hardwood as if to feel the rhythm with the house. There were no footsteps. The porch light showed only a smear of darkness. The back door had a chain. It was latched from inside. The windows revealed nothing but the night's black skin. Each time, the 3 knocks were given in the same spacing, like a short phrase of Morse made of bone against timber. 3 soft strikes, then nothing. By the end of the week, they were tired in a way that made them watch the night more than sleep through it. Their friends suggested pranksters, raccoons, the county boy who stole gas from tanks. The couple tried to laugh along, but on the 8th night they called the sheriff. Sheriff Baines came the next afternoon in a brown Ford, carrying a thermos and a thick county logbook. He listened to the couple speak in fragments over the kitchen table. He shrugged once, then grew quiet, as if the house had a way of asking a question, and the county had not learned an answer. He took the recorder home and promised to play it for dispatch when the radios died down. The recording returned with a timestamp pressed into the tape and a note scribbled along the margin of the sheriff's log. 2:13 a.m. Spatten noted. Playback consistent. No persons found on approach. What made Sheriff Baines sit up was the 2nd tape they found underneath a neat stack of case files in the dispatch office. A scratchy old recording no one there had remembered being placed in their hands. It was a voice recording from 1969, a missing person call that had been left on a battered answering machine. A voice trembling, describing a man who'd been out on the road the night his wife woke to 3 steady knocks. The voice on the tape was not the same as the one now living on the new couple's recorder, but when the sheriff fed both through the agency's playback device, the rhythms matched exactly. 3 knocks, the same spacing, the same faint pause where breath might gather before the world moved on. That pattern, Sheriff Baines said aloud, and his jaw tightened. That's the same knocking reported with the Thomases' disappearance. Not a lot of folks were still knocking like that in these parts. The Thomases. The case name settled like dust. A local couple who had disappeared in 1969. They had left the house mid-sentence and never returned. Their car was found idling at the edge of an old logging road. There were footprints in the mud that led up to the car and ended. There was a weathered knothole in an eastern fence post, and, in the morning, a single set of muddy boots missing. The investigation had never yielded a suspect. The files had been shelved, then boxed, then half forgotten. Now, 8 years later, a pattern in a new house matched a fragment from that old case. The couple agreed to sleep in the sheriff's spare room for a night while evidence was collected. They left the fern and the record players behind and walked out through an ordinary morning that felt, in retrospect, like someone stepping away from a stage mid-act. Sheriff Baines and a deputy walked the property with flashlights, batteries humming and light slicing across damp leaves. They found nothing beyond the familiar, the henhouse, the tree with a broken limb, an old rusted swing, and the long, well-travelled path to the road. Still they took measurements. They placed a pad of paper beneath the chain lock on the door to check for lateral pressure. They set up a better tape recorder, a reel-to-reel, with a wide frequency band. The deputy, a young man with a careful face, left the tape running in the kitchen and went to bed downstairs on a cot. The tape ran through the night in a low, mechanical whisper. At 2:13 a.m. the reel clicked like a metronome. The 3 knocks arrived, measured and close. On the tape, there was a noise the deputy described later simply as a breath that didn't belong to the house. It was not wind. It was not the house. It was a held thing, almost like the sound a person makes, trying to listen without making their own noise. They checked the perimeter. They combed the yard. They searched the fields with dogs and with the county's rhythm of flashlights. No one was found. The henhouse was closed. The swing had dew on the chains. The footprints in the soft earth around the porch were the prints of the sheriff and the deputy. The deputy, quiet in his report, admitted that he had stood with his hand on the door at 2:14, expecting to feel the knocks come from wood. He felt only the morning cold. It's as if the knock had been delivered to the house and not through it, he wrote. Within a week, other oddities accrued around the file. A neighbour 10 houses down called to say she sometimes woke with a start in those same early hours and peered into her yard to see a shadow she could not name. Another man retrieved an old cassette from his attic, an audio reel from a trucker in 1973 who swore he'd heard 3 knocks from the cubby of his own rig at 2:13 while parked off Route 9. When the sheriff fed the new and old recordings into a slow play device and looked at the waveform, he found a rhythm repeating across decades like a scar in the county's audio. No one could say what the knocking meant, or who, if anyone, stood beyond a porch light. The Thomases file offered no explanation. The tape of the trucker offered only static and the faint interference of a night that might have been spent between radios. The couple, unable to live with the unnamed visitor, moved out 3 weeks after their arrival. They packed neatly, left the fern behind, and shut the door. They requested the tape be retained by the sheriff. Their hands shook when they signed the form. Months later, after the leaves turned and the country learned to sleep through the wind again, a local historian took an interest. She wanted to make a note of patterns in the region. She loved small, repeating motifs, cobwebs on neglected fence posts, identical scratches on the undersides of attics. She asked to catalogue the tapes. Sheriff Baines acquiesced. When she sat alone in the dispatch office late one night and listened to the old reels, the historian heard not a single inexplicable thing but a collage. The door knocks, faint animal calls, a car window rolling down in the background, church bells on a Sunday far away, the distant sound of a train that had not used those rails since the 1950s. On one tape, beneath the knocks, there was a voice, so soft it might have been a draught or a pocket of air through an open seam. She enhanced the audio the way archivists always do, with patience and with the sort of respect people pay to the dead. The voice resolved into a single syllable that could be heard as either a name or a plea. It was small and worn like a coin. She traced the syllable through 2 other tapes and found it present at the same temporal offset after each set of knocks. It was not a transcription she felt comfortable printing in a report, not with the way the syllable could be read as a name some nights and as a sound of despair on others. She folded the file and placed it back in the box. Rumour, like music through a wall, altered the facts. Neighbours who had once mentioned knocks in offhand conversation now told the story as if the knocks had been an answer to a call. They were trying to find someone, some would say. They were calling for help. Others said the taps were a warning. A small group of teenagers began to drive by the house late at night and bang on the back door themselves at 2:13, daring each other to elicit something that might frighten them into the cab. They returned home with stories of lights that flared at the edge of trees and a white shape too quick for their cameras. Sheriff Baines, grown older and wearied by the county's small recurring mysteries, kept the largest set of tapes in a drawer where the dispatch clerks could not easily reach. He regarded patterns the way a man regards weather, as something to note and adapt to, not as prophecy. But on quiet nights, when he sat in his office with the lights down and the telephone sleeping against the desk, he admitted to himself that something about the knocks had a persistence that made him uneasy. It was not malevolence, he thought. It had the stubbornness of an unanswered question, like a lost radio signal refusing to die. Years slid by. The Thomases remained a shell case in the archives. The farmhouse was sold again and again, its paint retouched, its porches rebuilt, its new owners unaware of the tape boxes stored in a county drawer. On more than one occasion, a new tenant called the sheriff with concern about noises. They were told the basic things, to check locks, to call if they felt threatened. Some later admitted they had heard the knocking at 2:13 and some had not. Memory is the room where many things are allowed to be either present or absent. What made the recordings unsettling to those who listened was not that they predicted harm or that they promised a next act. Instead, they offered a continuity, a loop that threaded disparate nights together. A trucker in 1973, a missing couple in 1969, a new pair in 1977. The sound kept arriving at the same minute as if fate or habit had set an invisible clock. People who watched for it often felt afterward as though they had pressed their palms to a thin wall and felt a heartbeat that was not their own. The couple who had moved out never returned to live in that town. Years later, they sent a letter to Sheriff Baines, short, with handwriting that had been softened by distance. They wrote that sometimes, in a different house and a different state, they would be awoken by a tap on a window or a figure near the fence, always at odd hours, always distant. They said they tried to tell themselves noises are the brain's work, the way a mind stitches a dream. They could not claim a belief. They preferred to name it instead as a fact. They had been followed by a sound. It followed with no face and no finish. On the tape that the historian kept in her private archive, played on nights when the house outside her window was very still, the 3 knocks sound less ominous and more like an insistence. They arrive as if someone is pressing a memory into a lock, trying with small percussive patience to be let in. The county never closed the file. The Thomases remained missing. The only thing that never quite quieted was the knock itself, which would, in small, repeating ways, appear again over the years, on a reel from a trucker, on a neighbour's cassette, on a bored teenager's boot heel against the back door. Each time it would come at 2:13 a.m., 3 strikes, always spaced the same. Not a message, not a threat, perhaps simply a habit of the dark, a thing that finds the same minute to practice itself. If one believes in signs, the knock could be read as an answer to someone else's silence. If one believes in habit, it could be the echo of a ritual long since outlived. Either way, the house learned to carry the sound the way it carried its hinges, with the patient weight of ordinary things that continue, whether or not anyone is watching. And sometimes, when a new tenant sits awake listening to the radiators and the rain, they will swear they hear 3 soft knocks at 2:13 and will not go to the door. They will lie very still and imagine the person on the other side, or the emptiness beyond, and in the not moving of their bodies, they will become, for a single small night, part of the house's long practice of listening. The couple left the farmhouse in a slow, careful motion, carrying only what they could grasp in 2 small suitcases and the record crate. The fern was left by the kitchen window, a silent witness to nights filled with measured knocks. The sheriff noted their departure in the log, quietly, like a man marking the end of a weather event. The house, unchanged in its architecture, seemed smaller once empty. Without the warmth of human habitation, the wooden boards stretched and sighed in the wind with a sound that resembled memory. For weeks the tapes remained in the sheriff's drawer. Baines, methodical in his approach, played them in the quiet moments of the afternoon, alone in the office, headphones snug against his ears. He had learned to listen to small sounds, the creak of a hinge, a footfall on gravel, the faraway train whistle, and now he trained his attention to the subtle insistence of 3 knocks at 2:13 a.m. Each tap arrived with the precision of a metronome, repeating a pattern that had persisted across nearly a decade. It was the sort of regularity that demanded attention but offered no answer. The sheriff contacted the county archives. A historian named Martha Elridge responded, an archivist with a patient hand and a love for small, persistent patterns in history. She worked in a room filled with brittle papers and boxes that smelled of dust and wood. When Baines placed the cassette into her hands, she noted the date and the scratches along the tape's side, as though the medium itself bore the scars of time. She promised to listen carefully and report any irregularities. Her voice, calm and deliberate, carried the same weight as someone reading letters from soldiers long gone. Martha began her work in the dim light of the archive, leaning over the cassette recorder and a stack of transcribed logs. Each night she played the tape repeatedly, slowing and amplifying portions that seemed insignificant at first. Beneath the 3 knocks, she detected faint background noises, a settling board, a faint whine of wind, perhaps a distant owl. But what drew her attention was something else. A voice, nearly imperceptible, threaded under the knocks. It was soft, trembling, a syllable or two that did not resolve into a word. She enhanced the audio using techniques she had learned for old recordings, the type of care historians apply when the letter may have been written in haste or fear. The sound persisted across tapes. The same 3-knock rhythm appeared in the Thomas case from 1969, faintly on a reel from a trucker parked by Route 9 in 1973, and now in the recordings from 1977. It was as though an invisible hand had pressed the same key across different years, the same minute of the night marking a recurring motif. Martha felt the subtle weight of something unnatural, not in the sound itself, but in its stubborn constancy. It demanded acknowledgement, yet offered no context, no resolution. Meanwhile, the couple, living now in a different town far from the farmhouse, found that the sensation of being followed lingered. At 2:13 a.m., small accidental sounds in their apartment could startle them. A branch brushing a window, a neighbour's door clicking, even the refrigerator humming in a familiar rhythm could evoke a memory of that precise, deliberate three-knock pattern. The sensation was not fear exactly, but a subtle tightening of attention, a reminder that some events leave behind an echo that no distance can erase. Locally, word of the knocks had spread quietly. A neighbour reported seeing shadows move across her garden, inexplicable shapes just beyond the edge of the porch light. A teenager recounted the night he and a friend had dared each other to knock on the door at 2:13. They had waited on the curb, breath caught, flashlights trembling. When they returned, they swore the swing chains had creaked on their own, and a white shape had passed the edge of their light, faster than either camera or eye could record. These reports, casual at first, gained gravity as the archivist began noting them alongside the recordings. The sheriff, for his part, observed the pattern with the same restraint one might observe the seasons. He did not rush to conclusion or speculation. He logged each tape, noting times, date, and faint environmental sounds. Yet even he, accustomed to decades of minor anomalies and unexplained occurrences, acknowledged a discomfort. The persistence of the sound across years and circumstances hinted at a reality that was neither fully material nor entirely imagined. The knocks carried the patience of something waiting, not for him, nor for anyone specific, but for acknowledgement. Months passed. Martha continued her work, cross-referencing tapes and transcriptions. She found that the syllable beneath the knocks appeared consistently, slightly delayed, in each recording. It was never loud, never fully articulable, but always present. She documented it carefully, using italics in her transcription to indicate uncertainty. The phenomenon was not malevolent, yet it was insistent. It pressed against the ordinary world with a rhythm that humans could detect, measure, and yet never fully interpret. One autumn evening, Martha listened through headphones and let the soundscape of the 1977 tapes fill her small apartment. The wind outside pressed gently against the window. She imagined the couple unpacking records and potted plants, unaware that a sound had already found them. She imagined the trucker in 1973 alone in the cab, ears straining. She imagined the Thomases decades prior, rising in the dark to find a world that had shifted in ways no one could explain. Each narrative was discrete, yet threaded together by 3 precise taps at 2:13 a.m. Sheriff Baines occasionally revisited the tapes. Sometimes he played them aloud, letting the sound echo through the dispatch office. He would sit back, imagining the distance between the sound's origin and the recorder, imagining the paths it had taken, the rooms it had passed through, the years it had survived. He had grown accustomed to hearing it not as a threat, not as a message, but as a marker of time, of continuity, of memory. The knocks were an insistence on being remembered. The farmhouse changed hands multiple times. Each new occupant encountered ordinary creaks and sighs of a wooden house. Some reported noises they could not identify, which were dismissed as common house sounds. Others, more sensitive, might hear 3 faint knocks at 2:13 a.m. and lie still, aware of the past embedded in the boards. Occasionally, letters arrived for Sheriff Baines from the original couple, recounting how, even far away, the rhythm haunted them. It was never loud, never threatening, only present, a small, repeating insistence. Neighbors noted minor oddities, a light flickering at unusual hours, shadows at the edge of vision, the sound of a single branch tapping against the porch. Children dared each other to knock on the old farmhouse door. None of these actions changed the rhythm. The knocks returned as they always had, precise and patient. Some suggested it was a warning, others a reminder, some an echo of loss. The sheriff, archivist, and the couple had no consensus. All they could do was listen. Martha, late one night, recorded her observations in a small notebook. She wrote about patterns, repetition, and the endurance of sound over years. She compared it to music kept alive by memory rather than performance, a rhythm preserved by fidelity rather than intent. The knock, she noted, was neither malicious nor benign. It simply existed. It demanded a witness, a listener, someone to acknowledge its measure in the quiet. When the recordings were finally archived, they were placed carefully in boxes labelled by year and case. The sheriff kept a set in his personal drawer. He never played them loudly. He listened through headphones and thought of the house, the couple, the Thomases, the trucker. The knocks were not for him, nor for anyone else in particular. They were a temporal pattern, a small insistence that the world, and its events, could repeat in a quiet, precise manner, if only one paid attention. And so for anyone who listens closely, in the late hours when the wind moves through the trees, the sound may appear. 3 soft knocks at 2:13 a.m., measured, calm, unyielding. It is not meant to frighten, not meant to harm. It is a reminder. Some sounds have memory. Some places keep time. And sometimes, in the quiet of the night, one finds oneself simply listening. The farmhouse had settled into its next life. Paint was retouched, the porch beams patched. New owners arrived with polite optimism, unaware of the sounds embedded in its structure. Some nights they would hear ordinary noises, the swell of wood, the sigh of settling, the creak of old hinges. On a few nights, more attuned occupants would hear it. 3 deliberate knocks at 2:13 a.m. It was never loud. It was precise, calm, insistent. It did not demand action, only acknowledgement. Neighbours began to speak quietly in passing to one another. The widow with the hens noted that at night she sometimes felt the wind shift differently around the house. Her radio would flicker at the hour, though she had long since tuned it off. A man down the road, living alone, recounted a time when he parked by the logging road at dusk and heard 3 knocks echoing faintly through the trees. When he approached the farmhouse, the windows were dark. There was no movement. He thought at first it might have been an animal. Later, he learned of the previous couple's experiences, and the patterns began to make sense in an uncanny way. 2:13 a.m., 3 strikes, no one seen. The archivist Martha Elridge collected these testimonies with careful attention. She catalogued every report in her ledger, the date, the time, the witness, the environmental conditions. She noted discrepancies with the precision of a historian, but more importantly, she noted the consistency. Across years, decades even, the rhythm appeared, a faint yet unwavering presence threading through different lives. In some cases, people reported hearing the knocks and doing nothing. Others reacted, opening doors, peering into the darkness, leaving windows ajar. Yet the rhythm persisted, untouched. A cassette surfaced from 1973, recorded by a trucker who had parked along Route 9 during a heavy autumn rain. In the recording, 3 soft knocks could be heard against the side of his truck, followed by the faint, indistinct sound of footsteps retreating into the fog. The trucker had originally filed the tape away as a curiosity, then forgotten it. When Martha played it alongside the Thomases' missing person tape and the 1977 couple's recordings, she noticed the precise spacing. 3 taps, 1 brief pause, 1 final tap, the same metric rhythm across 10 years of history. Martha became meticulous. Each night she would play a combination of the tapes while taking notes. At times, she believed she could hear a voice underneath the knocks, a syllable, perhaps a name, faint and fleeting, audible only when the recordings were slowed. It was not consistent in tone, but it was there, soft, breathy, almost a sigh caught in wood or air. The syllable offered no clarity, only insistence. She thought of it as a whisper that had become physical, a sound that refused to disappear. Meanwhile, the original couple, living miles away from the farmhouse, carried a residual tension with them. At precisely 2:13 a.m., They occasionally jolted awake, convinced they had heard a knock against a window, a door, or even a distant tree. Sometimes it was a simple branch brushing in the wind, sometimes nothing at all. Yet each time their bodies remembered the rhythm, the way it had pressed against them in the farmhouse. They did not speak of it often, but each had kept a private record of those nights. Short notes scribbled in the dim glow of a bedside lamp. Local teens, ever curious and daring, began to test the house. They would arrive in small groups, flashlights trembling in the darkness, and tap on doors, wait for nothing, then flee. One reported seeing a flicker of white move past the trees. Another said the swing on the oak moved without wind. The rhythm of the knocks remained unaffected. The house did not answer them directly, but it seemed to absorb the attempts to mark the evening, to continue its quiet insistence. Sheriff Baines observed the phenomenon with a quiet patience. He did not speculate on malevolence, nor did he attempt to provide answers. He understood patterns and habits, and he catalogued the recordings as carefully as a meteorologist might record rainfall over decades. The knocks, he realized, were neither threat nor warning. They were a temporal signal, persistent, recurring, and exact. It was as if the house, the land, and the few living witnesses had conspired to preserve a small, repeated pattern, a sound whose purpose was simply to exist. Martha, reviewing the trucker's 1973 tape alongside the 1969 Thomas's call and the 1977 couple's recordings, noticed subtle differences. Background noise shifted, footsteps, rain, wind, the hum of engines, but the rhythm remained constant. The three knocks were like a heartbeat, steady and unyielding. She began to feel a strange intimacy with the sound, a connection to people she would never meet. It was a presence that transcended the individuals, threading through time itself. The couple who had moved out shared their story with close friends and family, careful to avoid sensationalism. They spoke of nights when sleep was impossible, when the smallest creak could send their minds racing. They never heard the knocks as a threat. They described them as persistent and calm, like the world reminding them of itself in a pattern they could not ignore. Their letters to the sheriff years later echoed the same sentiment. The sound had followed them in memory, if not in reality, and it had left its mark, a quiet insistence on awareness, a rhythm that could not be silenced by distance. The farmhouse changed hands multiple times. Each tenant approached it differently. Some never noticed the pattern. Some reported faint noises at odd hours. Occasionally, an owner would hear 3 taps at 2:13 a.m. and freeze, sensing a continuity that spanned decades. The rhythm had become part of the place, as tangible as the walls and beams, as imperceptible as the hum of settling wood. The archivist noted all of this with meticulous care. She realized that the knocks were more than an isolated anomaly. They were a cultural artifact of the region, subtle, persistent, and intertwined with human perception. Patterns repeated across generations, threading ordinary lives with the extraordinary. There was no malevolence in the sound, no finality. It existed as a quiet, rhythmic reminder of presence, of continuity, and of time's quiet insistence. One night, alone in her apartment, Martha played the recordings in sequence, letting the knocks echo through her headphones. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the window pane. She imagined the Thomases in 1969, the trucker in 1973, the couple in 1977, the neighbour, the teenagers, all part of the same temporal line. The knocks were not answering questions. They were not demanding attention. They were simply marking their existence across years, embedding themselves in memory and recording. They persisted, patient, precise, and insistent. And as she listened, Martha realized the subtle truth of the phenomenon. The sound had outlasted the people who first heard it. It had traveled across decades and homes, and it would continue beyond her and beyond those who had catalogued it. The rhythm would return, patient and unhurried, at 2:13 a.m., 3 knocks precise, a quiet insistence on being acknowledged. The rhythm, she understood, was not a warning, nor a plea, nor a threat. It was something older than the farmhouse itself, a pattern that threaded through time, a simple, deliberate insistence that some sounds do not disappear. It was neither kind nor cruel. It simply was, and those who listened closely would carry its echo in their memory long after the doors had closed, the boards had settled, and the last tenant had moved on. The house was empty of the original couple, yet full in its own way. The sheriff had seen nothing, yet catalogued everything. The archivist had heard everything, yet understood nothing fully. The rhythm persisted, patient and precise, a reminder that some sounds are not made for answers. They are made to be remembered. The house on the quiet county road had stood longer than anyone could remember. Its paint was faded, its boards creaked in ways only old houses do. But some nights, even now, the rhythm returned. 3 soft knocks at 2:13 a.m., patient, deliberate, unyielding. The new tenants had long since left, yet the sound seemed untethered from occupancy, as if it existed independently of those who slept within the walls. It was easy to wonder who or what kept the count. Was it the memory of the Thomases still pressing through the years, their absence marking each night? Or was it something else, older, patient, waiting for ears tuned enough to notice? Could a sound remember, even if the humans who first heard it did not? Sheriff Baines, seated at his desk, often replayed the recordings. He would lean back in his chair, headphones snug, and ask himself aloud, though no one could hear, "Does it want us to know it's there? Or is it simply marking time?" He had catalogued patterns for decades, observed disappearances and small-town oddities, yet the knocks defied his experience. They were not threats, and yet they carried a weight heavier than most threats, the weight of persistence. Martha Elridge, the archivist, sometimes pondered the same question in her quiet apartment, letting the faint echo of the knocks linger in her mind as she sipped her evening tea. She wondered aloud, softly, to herself, or to the blank page of her notebook. What happens if no one listens anymore? Do the knocks fade, or do they wait? She did not know the answer. Perhaps they waited indefinitely, patient as stone, indifferent to curiosity or fear. Even the couple who had fled the house years ago carried the rhythm within them. On nights when a tree branch tapped the window, they would sit still, heart quietly alert, wondering, is it really the wind? Or is it following me still? They could not explain why, after so many years, the sound had not released them. It was as though a minute in time had claimed them, binding memory and sound together in a way the rest of the world could not perceive. And what of the neighbours? The widow with the hens, the teenagers daring each other, the truckers' forgotten recordings, they all shared a silent, unspoken acknowledgement. The knocks threaded through lives like a subtle current, unnoticed by most, but unmistakable to those attuned. One might ask, if the world is full of so many small noises, why do some insist on repetition? Why do some sounds refuse to be ignored? There was no answer, only the rhythm, 3 taps, 1 pause, 1 final tap. At 2:13 a.m., like a heartbeat measured on an invisible clock. It arrived without malice, without warning, yet impossible to dismiss. Those who heard it knew it as a sound outside ordinary cause, a patient, precise reminder that some things, even absent bodies, endure. Late one night, Martha placed the recordings in sequence again, letting the knocks from 1969, 1973 and 1977 collide in her headphones. She imagined the Thomases leaving their home, leaving everything behind. She imagined the trucker listening through fogged windows and the young couple in 1977 counting the taps in their living room. And she asked herself the question the human host would pose to any listener sitting alone in the dark. Have you ever felt something just outside your window at night and wondered if anyone or anything was really there? No one had a definitive answer. The knocks were a presence without form, a rhythm without explanation. They had outlasted every person who tried to catalogue them, every witness who paused to listen. They had survived the months and years, the changing tenants, the new walls and patched paint. They were constant, subtle, and inexorably patient, and yet the human mind could not help but search for cause. The sheriff would sometimes ask himself, if I went to the house now, would I hear the same pattern? Or does it exist only in memory, carried from one listener to the next? No one could tell. It was as if the sound had chosen its own medium, independent of walls, wood, or human attention. It had become, in a way, immortal. As the night deepened, the farmhouse sat in its silence, and the county world continued on its quiet rotation. And still, somewhere, or perhaps everywhere, the taps persisted, unbroken, a faint metronome marking time in a universe that otherwise seemed indifferent. The final thought, whispered as if into the listener's ear, is a question no one can answer. When you hear a knock at your door tonight, will you ignore it, or will you listen? The answer is never simple because the knock is patient. It waits. It returns. It persists. And sometimes, if one listens long enough, the rhythm becomes more than a sound. It becomes a story. In the hush of that lingering moment, the night shifts, and attention turns elsewhere. Perhaps the farmhouse falls silent. Perhaps the knocks continue, far beyond human reckoning, marking a minute in time no one can claim. And for the listeners who are awake, the human host offers a soft, final observation. Some things are meant to be noticed, not understood. And with that, the house remains, the taps remain. And somewhere down a dark county road, the world continues quietly, punctuated by 3 soft knocks at 2:13 a.m., patient, deliberate, eternal. The farmhouse had grown older with each passing decade, its wood faded to a pale grey, its boards bowed under the slow weight of time. The paint, touched up here and there, could not erase the memory of seasons, nor the impression left by those who had slept and lived within its walls. And though new families arrived and left, the house remained stubbornly familiar in its silence, its stillness occasionally punctuated by the sound that had become its quiet signature. 3 soft knocks at 2:13 a.m. Always 3, always precise, always the same. They were never loud, never urgent. They were measured, calm, deliberate. Yet there was something in their timing, in the patience that informed them, that made the human heart prick in recognition. Who or what was counting? Was it a remnant of the Thomases, absent from the world but still insistent? Or was it something older, something patient, observing human life from just beyond the veil? The question hung, unspoken but persistent, like dust in a sunbeam. Sheriff Baines had grown used to the sound in theory, though not in experience. He had catalogued tapes, interviewed neighbours, noted reports from passing teens and distant truckers, and yet he could not deny the tension that returned whenever he replayed the recordings. Leaning back in his chair, headphones in place, he would ask quietly, almost reflexively, does it want to be noticed, or does it exist without need of attention? Sometimes he imagined approaching the farmhouse at 2:13, flashlight in hand, but the thought made the air feel heavier. He did not doubt the sound, it was documented, repeated, but he could not decipher intent. And perhaps he thought that was the point. Martha Elridge, sitting in her dimly lit apartment, had begun to think of the knocks as something that transcended time. She would play the 1969 reel of the Thomases, then the Truckers' 1973 cassette, then the 1977 recording of the young couple. Sometimes, slowed down, she could hear the faintest whisper beneath the taps, a breath, a syllable, a name, unclear but deliberate. She would stop the tape and ask herself, softly, if no one listens, does it vanish, or does it wait? She wrote the question in the margin of her notebook, italicized, as though the sound itself could read and answer. Across the county, the memory of the knocks had entered lives like a subtle pulse. The widow with the hens, long attuned to small changes in her environment, noted that her kitchen light sometimes flickered, the shadows seeming to bend just a little differently around the edges of the porch. The teenagers, daring each other to approach the house at night, felt a tension they could not explain. The air seemed to thicken at 2:13, carrying with it the faintest pressure, the sense that someone or something was watching, waiting, marking time. It was not malevolent, and yet it was not benign. It existed, and perhaps that was enough to unsettle anyone paying attention. The original couple, now settled in a distant town, carried the rhythm with them. On certain nights, a wind chime, a branch brushing the window, a neighbour's door closing could trigger the memory. A heartbeat quickened, a pulse of alertness rose, and a private question surfaced. Is it real, or is my mind remembering too well? Even in their safe new apartment, they could not entirely escape the resonance of the sound. It had woven itself into their perception of nighttime, teaching them that some patterns follow people, invisible but precise, patient but insistent. Martha considered these experiences carefully. Across tapes and testimonies, she found a strange consistency. The knocks were always three, always spaced the same, always arriving at 2:13 a.m., and yet their environment changed. The house, the occupants, even the wind, everything else shifted, yet the pattern endured. It was as though the sound was independent of time and matter, threading itself across decades, through different spaces and lives, a subtle instrument playing a rhythm in the dark. And she wondered, softly, almost as if asking the listener directly, if a sound could persist beyond those who first heard it, what would it become? Would it become memory? Would it become warning? Or would it simply remain like a mark of time, waiting for attention it neither demanded nor expected? She did not know. She only observed, catalogued, and listened. Sheriff Baines, on slow nights, sometimes replayed all the recordings simultaneously. He imagined the Thomases leaving their home in 1969, the trucker in 1973, leaning against the cab, ears straining through fog, the young couple in 1977, sitting cross-legged on the living room floor, listening for 3 soft taps. And he asked himself aloud, as the human host would, for the audience, if you were in that house tonight, would you recognize the pattern or dismiss it as coincidence? The question lingered because there was no answer that fully satisfied the mind or calmed the heart. Even the most skeptical would notice it if they listened. A branch tapping at the window, a board creaking, a faint, almost imperceptible echo of sound in a dark room. It all could be explained by ordinary causes. Yet some nights, when the air was just so, the taps emerged, 3 soft knocks, precise and deliberate. It was impossible to ignore once noticed, and impossible to understand. It had become its own entity, neither here nor there, yet everywhere it needed to be. The house itself seemed alive in memory, its silence heavy with history. Wood remembered footsteps, paint remembered hands, and the rhythm remembered ears. The new occupants often noted ordinary creaks, perhaps a floorboard settling or a window rattling. unaware that they were sharing their nights with the past. Occasionally, one would hear 3 faint taps at 2:13 a.m. and pause, wondering what could be so deliberate in the stillness of an ordinary house. In those moments, the human mind leaned forward, alert, asking quietly, "Who or what is outside my window?" And perhaps that was the core of it. The rhythm was not a message nor a threat. It did not demand action. It did not arrive to startle or frighten. It was an insistence, a small and measured insistence, marking time and memory, reminding anyone listening that something persisted beyond the ordinary world. The human host would lean in at this point softly. Have you ever woken in the night and felt something just beyond your window and wondered if it was waiting for you or merely following the world's invisible rhythm? The question had no answer. It was only the listener's responsibility to notice, to pause, to remember. And some did not, but the rhythm continued, patient, deliberate, inexorable. Martha, sitting in her quiet apartment, let the recordings play through the night. She could hear faint whispers beneath the taps now, almost indistinguishable syllables like echoes of people long gone. She wondered if the sound had absorbed fragments of those who listened, if it carried pieces of human attention through decades. She noted it carefully, writing the observation in the margin of her ledger. The sound preserves memory as much as it preserves itself. And as the night deepened, the farmhouse, the county road, the distant trees, all faded into quiet darkness. Yet somewhere, if one listened carefully, 3 soft knocks marked the minute. 2:13 a.m. The rhythm pressed against the dark, pressing into ears, into memory, into the spaces where curiosity and unease meet. The final question, the one the human host would pose to the listener in the stillness, is simple. When you hear a sound outside your window tonight, will you ignore it, or will you listen? There is no right answer. There is only the rhythm, patient, deliberate, unyielding. And the house remains. The boards sigh, the floor creaks, and in the quietest hour, if you listen carefully, you may hear it. 3 soft knocks at 2:13 a.m., a simple, persistent insistence that some things once begun do not end. They only wait for someone to notice. Some sounds are not threats. Some sounds are not messages. Some sounds are merely persistent. But when they insist, even in the quietest night, they are impossible to ignore. And so the listener is left with a final thought, gentle but unnerving, carried by the human host's soft voice through the darkness. Some things are meant to be noticed, not understood. The taps endure. The minutes pass. The world continues, oblivious. And in the hush of that lingering night, the rhythm waits, patient as ever, for the next ear, willing to hear. The night was unusually still, almost hesitant, as if it, too, were waiting. Streetlights flickered over quiet suburban lawns, their glow casting long, wavering shadows across neatly trimmed hedges. On one corner, a single porch light blinked into life and then steadied, a beacon against the darkness. It was the kind of ordinary suburban night that invites comfort, yet hides the smallest disturbances that carry the weight of fear. Ethan had just returned from his late shift at the diner, the smell of coffee and fry grease still clinging faintly to his jacket. He paused at the edge of his driveway, keys in hand, and noticed the porch light. It was on, though he was sure he had turned it off earlier in the evening. The house was empty, save for him, and the quiet pressed around his chest with a subtle insistence. He thought for a moment that the light was a mistake. Perhaps his neighbor had dropped by, or maybe the bulb was on an automatic timer. Yet something in the way the light carved shadows across the steps made him pause, made him feel a pull he could not name. Something was out there, waiting. The human host would ask softly, "Have you ever felt it? The sensation that someone is just beyond the light, watching, waiting, patient?" Ethan felt it now. A pause in the world's rhythm, a hesitation in the night air. The shadows near the edge of the porch seemed deeper than shadows should be, as if they carried weight. Ethan approached the door slowly, his hand brushing against the cold brass knob. The faintest creak of a hinge made him glance sideways. Nothing moved. The street was empty, but the sensation persisted. Someone had been there, and they hadn't yet left. Inside, the house smelled of cinnamon and wood polish, reminders of the day's normalcy. Yet Ethan could not shake the feeling that something had stepped across the threshold without invitation, something that did not belong. He checked the locks 1, then 2, then 3 times, each turn of the key accompanied by a quiet tremor in his chest. It began subtly. At first, a shift in the shadows at the corner of his vision. He told himself it was the streetlight outside, or the angle of the lamp in the living room. But then there was a tap, a single, deliberate sound at the front window. Soft, yet insistent. Ethan froze. The sound was not random. It carried intention, measured and quiet. He asked himself aloud, though he knew no answer would come, "Is someone really there, or am I imagining it?" His breath rose and fell in short, careful measures as he strained to listen. Outside, the night held its own rhythm. Trees swayed gently in the breeze, leaves brushing against one another with a soft rustle. But beneath the wind and the faint hum of distant traffic, there was something else. A presence, measured and deliberate, that waited beyond the porch light. Ethan could not see it, could not name it, but he could feel its insistence pressing against the ordinary air of his home. He stepped back from the window, heart tightening. The human host would lean in here, softly. Have you ever sensed the space just beyond your light? A shadow that waits, not threatening, not moving, but undeniably there? Ethan had. He felt it now with the clarity of fear, tempered by curiosity. For nights afterward, the pattern repeated. Always the porch light first, glowing steadily in the dark. Always the pause, a hesitation that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Always the waiting. Sometimes it was a single tap on the window frame. Other nights, just a subtle impression of presence in the air, impossible to measure, impossible to dismiss. Ethan began recording. He set up his phone, capturing ambient sound as best he could, hoping to catch evidence, something tangible. And sometimes the recordings revealed more than he expected. Faint footsteps, a whisper of movement across the yard, even the occasional click of something small moving just out of frame. He listened to the playback alone, late at night, a creeping certainty in his chest. Someone or something had been there, waiting. The human host might ask here, in that quiet, lingering tone, "What would you do if you heard the sound of movement in your yard, just beyond the safe circle of light?" Ethan did what many of us would do. He waited, eyes fixed, body tense, heart echoing the rhythm of something unseen. Neighbors noticed the porch light too, though they said nothing at first. A passing jogger would see the glow through the blinds and wonder why it remained on so late. A mail carrier would pause at the curb, sensing a shift in the ordinary night air, and quickly move on. Some reported a figure standing just beyond the light, always too indistinct to identify, always retreating when approached. Yet no one confronted it directly. It existed in the periphery, patient, deliberate, measured. Ethan's nights grew long. Sleep became hesitant, measured in intervals, interrupted by the sense of someone waiting. Even in daylight, he could not shake the awareness that presence lingered beyond the light, just out of reach. He wondered repeatedly, is it watching or simply waiting? And the answer never came, leaving only a quiet tension that threaded through the day and settled on his chest like a stone. One evening, Ethan thought he saw it clearly. The porch light cast a long glow over the steps and garden, and there, at the edge of visibility, a figure waited. Not moving, not speaking, just waiting. His breath caught. He wondered if the figure had always been there, embedded in the night, or if it had arrived only after he noticed. He stepped closer, heart hammering. The figure did not react. The human host would gently ask, "If you were in Ethan's place, would you step closer or turn away?" Ethan froze, caught in the tension of the moment. Then, as if in answer, the figure seemed to dissolve, fading into the darkness like mist, retreating from the morning sun. But the impression remained, solid in his mind, presence, patient and deliberate, waiting for recognition, but never yielding itself fully. He began to notice patterns. The figure never moved toward the house, never spoke, never crossed the threshold. It only waited just beyond the porch light, night after night. Ethan's recordings captured a faint hum, a subtle vibration in the air, too soft for casual attention, too precise to ignore. The sensation of being observed, though never confronted, became routine. Yet the question lingered. Why? Why does it wait? For a few nights, Ethan considered leaving, abandoning the house altogether. But a strange compulsion kept him there. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps stubbornness, or perhaps an unconscious desire to witness whatever force had chosen his porch as its point of attention. He asked himself softly in the quiet dark, do we stay because we are brave, or because we are already entwined in something we cannot leave? And so the porch light remained, a beacon in the dark, steady and unyielding. Shadows shifted, leaves whispered, the world moved as it always had. Yet someone, or something, waited beyond it, patient, deliberate, and always present. The night air itself seemed to carry its quiet insistence, brushing against skin, pressing lightly against awareness, leaving a faint, lingering impression long after sight and sound had faded. Ethan began documenting everything, not just the sounds or shadows, but the feeling of waiting, the subtle hesitation in the air, the rhythm of stillness that pressed upon his chest. And when he shared parts of it with friends, he found their responses varied: disbelief, curiosity, unease. None dismissed it outright, though few understood. The human host might ask, have you ever felt a presence so patient? It seems to exist outside ordinary time, outside your control. Ethan had, and he would carry the memory of it forever. The story has set the stage. The house, the porch light, and the figure beyond it have become central elements, establishing suspense and a lingering sense of unease. The nights grew longer in subtle ways. Ethan noticed it first in the way shadows leaned across the lawn, stretching farther than they should, as if the darkness itself were drawn to the porch light. The figure waiting just beyond it had not moved closer, nor had it retreated. It existed on the boundary between illumination and shadow, patient, deliberate, and constant. Ethan's curiosity wrestled with fear. He could feel the weight of attention pressing across the yard, a quiet insistence that something unseen was observing every small movement. One evening, as he stepped onto the porch, he paused and asked aloud, a question the human host would pose to the listener. Have you ever stood in your own doorway and felt that someone, unseen, knows exactly when you move? Ethan had, and the sensation made his pulse quicken in ways he could not control. He began leaving small indicators, subtle signals to test the figure's patience. A chair tipped slightly on the porch, a flashlight briefly turned toward the edge of the yard, small lights flicked in sequence. Each night, he monitored for reactions, straining to detect even the faintest hint that he had been noticed. The figure remained still. It did not respond, it waited. And that waiting carried a weight far heavier than any confrontation could. Neighbors began to notice the odd rhythm of the porch light. One night, a passing jogger slowed, sensing a shift in the air, a subtle tension that pressed against the ordinary calm of the neighborhood. A mail carrier lingered at the curb, eyes darting toward the light, then moved quickly on. They did not see the figure, not clearly, but all who approached the house carried a subtle, unspoken recognition that something was present. The human host might ask here, if you passed a house bathed in light and felt a quiet weight in the air, would you stop or continue? Ethan's neighbors and the listeners following his story understood both instincts all too well. Inside, Ethan tried to maintain normal routines, yet the pull of the porch light and the unseen observer tugged at his attention. He would sit in the living room, cup of tea in hand, pretending to read, but his eyes constantly flicked to the window. Every small noise, a branch scraping the siding, the faint hum of distant traffic, set him on edge. The presence beyond the porch was patient, deliberate, and silent, yet it demanded acknowledgement in ways that defied reason. One night, Ethan set up a camera, aiming it at the yard, hoping to capture proof of the figure. He reviewed the footage the next morning and noticed subtle anomalies, a flicker of movement too brief to identify, shadows bending in unnatural ways, faint reflections that did not correspond to known objects. It was never clear enough to name, but it was undeniable. Someone or something had been there. The human host would ask, have you ever caught a movement from the corner of your eye, only to realize when you looked again, nothing was there? But still you knew it had been? Ethan lived that question every night. Weeks passed, and the figure did not change. It did not approach the door, did not speak, did not leave. Ethan began speaking to it, quietly at first, testing the boundaries of the unseen. "Why are you here?" he whispered once into the night air. "What do you want?" The figure did not respond, yet Ethan swore he felt the slightest shift in the tension, as if acknowledgement alone was enough. He started noticing patterns beyond its stillness. The figure always arrived when the porch light turned on, often the exact moment he flicked the switch. It waited for him to notice, but not for him to act. He asked himself quietly, is it drawing me in, or merely existing outside my perception, waiting for something I cannot name? The presence seemed intelligent, patient, aware, and yet it remained inscrutable. It was as if the figure existed in its own temporal rhythm, intersecting with Ethan's world only at the edges, leaving traces in the air, subtle pressure against his awareness, and a quiet insistence that defied ordinary understanding. One evening, a gust of wind rattled the front door, and Ethan's heart raced. He hurried to the window, expecting the figure to move, or perhaps expecting it to vanish entirely. But it did not. The figure remained just beyond the porch light, still and calm, unyielding. Ethan realized then that it did not need to move. Its presence alone was enough, a quiet, deliberate mark upon his perception. The human host would lean in here, asking softly, have you ever felt the presence of someone who watches without moving, waits without speaking, and yet makes you question everything you thought you knew about your own safety? Ethan felt it constantly, each night a repetition of the same unsettling rhythm. Ethan's attempts to rationalize faltered. Could it be a neighbor playing tricks? No, the figure had no identifiable shape, no sound, no signature of ordinary life. Could it be a trick of the light? perhaps, but the subtle movements, the shifts in air, the faint pressure of its attention, all pointed to something else, something outside ordinary explanation. He experimented further. One night he left the porch light off entirely, curious to see if the figure would remain. He waited in silence, listening to the neighborhood settle. For hours, nothing happened. Then, exactly at 2:13 a.m., he noticed a subtle shift in the shadows, a pressure on the air, as if someone had merely stepped closer. He flicked the light back on. The figure waited, again, patient, deliberate, unyielding. The pattern was unmistakable. It did not act to harm, it did not act to speak. It waited. And its patience carried with it a weight heavier than any sudden intrusion could. Ethan began documenting everything, the small pressures, the subtle anomalies, the moments that made him pause and hold his breath. And when he shared fragments with a friend, the friend asked, incredulous, "Why are you still there?" The human host would pose the same question to the listener. Why do we remain even when the unknown waits just beyond the light? For Ethan, the answer was unclear. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was stubbornness. Perhaps in some small way he had already become part of the pattern, caught in the same patient rhythm as the figure beyond the porch light. The tension had escalated. The figure's presence was undeniable, its patience unnerving, and Ethan's curiosity and fear intertwined. The story had moved beyond mere observation into interaction, subtle testing, and the mounting realization that the unknown did not need to act to dominate the night. The night pressed in closer now. Ethan's eyes flicked constantly between the living room and the window, the porch light throwing shadows across the yard like long, quiet fingers. He could feel the presence beyond it, not moving, not speaking, yet impossible to ignore. It was patient, deliberate, watching, waiting, and that watching carried a weight heavier than any immediate threat. Have you ever stood in a quiet house and felt someone else's attention pressing against your chest, even when no one is there? That's exactly what Ethan felt every time the porch light flicked on. It was subtle, almost a whisper in the air, a pressure on the nerves that made breathing shallow, heartbeats loud. He stepped toward the door one night, flashlight in hand, every instinct screaming to move slowly, carefully, to observe without being noticed. The yard was empty. Or so it seemed. Shadows shifted, bending in ways that made him pause. The wind picked up just enough to move the leaves, yet the figure remained still. Patient. Silent. Immovable. Do you ever notice the small details when something feels off? A branch swaying when no wind should be there, a shadow bending at an impossible angle. That's how Ethan knew. It wasn't his imagination. Something waited beyond the porch light, and it was aware he was aware. He began leaving subtle signals, moving a chair, placing a small object near the steps, flicking the flashlight across the yard in brief pulses. Nothing changed, and yet he could feel it responding in the quiet pressure of the night, in the way shadows seem to recoil or thicken, always at the edges, always just beyond clear view. Have you ever tested the unknown, trying to see if it reacts, only to find your attempts met with patience rather than action? Ethan was learning that lesson. He whispered into the night, words carried across the yard like fragile paper. "Who are you? What do you want?" No answer came. Only the same quiet wait, the same measured insistence that he notice it. Some nights he thought he saw movement, a fleeting shift at the edge of the light, a slight lean, as if the figure was peering toward him, acknowledging his presence without breaking its own stillness. Every time he blinked, it seemed to vanish into the dark, leaving only an impression, a residue of awareness that made the hairs on his arms rise. Have you ever caught a shadow out of the corner of your eye, and when you turn fully, it is gone, but you know it was there? That was Ethan's world now, and it made every evening feel like a test he could never pass. He started setting up cameras around the yard, hoping for proof. And sometimes, in the recordings, anomalies appeared. Faint distortions, shapes bending unnaturally, a shadow that moved against its own logic. It was never clear enough to identify, never solid enough to confront, but undeniable. Do you ever feel watched when no one is there? Not just noticed, but truly observed, like your movements are catalogued, anticipated, weighed. That was the sensation pressing against Ethan's chest every night, an invisible rhythm he could not ignore. One night, he decided to leave the porch light off entirely. He waited inside, eyes fixed on the yard. Hours passed. The wind whispered through the trees, the house creaked. And then, 2:13 a.m., he felt it. A shift in the air, a subtle pressure that pressed against his awareness. It had waited, patient as ever. He turned the light back on and the figure remained just beyond the glow, still, deliberate, unyielding. Have you ever realized that some presences don't need to move, don't need to act, yet make themselves known in ways that are impossible to ignore? That was the figure, eternal in its quiet insistence, occupying a space between the light and shadow, and between fear and curiosity. Ethan began to understand the pattern. It came every night, arrived with the porch light, waited for recognition, and left nothing tangible behind. Yet its presence lingered in the air, in the shadows, in the tension pressing across his chest. The longer he stayed, the more he felt a pull, not toward fear, but toward acknowledgement, as if the figure demanded to be recognized simply for existing. Do you ever wonder if what waits beyond your light is aware of you? That is the question Ethan asked himself constantly. And though he could not answer, he could feel it. Every slight bend in the shadows, every tiny movement that his peripheral vision caught, these were proof enough. It was aware, it was patient, and it waited. Some nights Ethan tried to sleep, but the presence followed him inside his mind. The quiet pressure of its attention pressed even behind closed eyelids. Dreams were fractured, filled with the soft glow of the porch light and shapes that shifted just beyond clear perception. He awoke with a start, certain he had heard a tap, a shift, a movement that was never entirely there. Have you ever woken feeling someone, or something, was still there when the world seems to say otherwise? That's how Ethan's nights unfolded. Each evening, each flash of the porch light, each subtle impression in the air reminded him he was not alone. He began documenting everything meticulously, the time, the weather, the exact angle of shadows, every anomaly caught on camera. Yet no one could see what he felt. Friends laughed, suggested stress, or explained away the shadows and sounds, but Ethan knew. And he asked himself again, softly, do we notice the unseen because it exists, or because we are finally ready to see it? The presence never moved toward him. It never spoke. It never threatened. And yet it dominated the night, imposing itself in ways that defied ordinary understanding. Every step he took toward it was met with the same calm, deliberate stillness. Every whisper, every test, every flick of light was observed. And in that quiet awareness, Ethan realized something chilling. The figure did not need to act. Its patience, its insistence was enough. Have you ever felt powerless, not because you were weak, but because the unseen chose the terms of engagement? That is what pressed against Ethan every night. And yet, a strange compulsion kept him watching, listening, waiting. The figure had claimed a space in his world, and he could not leave it empty. And as the night deepened, The porch light cast its familiar glow, the shadows shifted, and the figure waited, patient, deliberate, eternal. Ethan leaned against the doorframe, listening to the subtle whispers of the night, heart tight with anticipation. And the question, softly delivered, threaded through the tension like a current. What would you do if something waited beyond your light, patient, deliberate, watching, and you knew it could not be reasoned with, but also could not be ignored? The air thickened, leaves rustled, a floorboard groaned, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. The presence was there, still and quiet, undeniable and patient. And in that pause, Ethan understood something fundamental. Some things do not reveal themselves. Some things do not act. They only wait. And in waiting, they shape the night, the mind, and the rhythm of attention itself. The nights had become almost unbearable. Ethan's routines, once ordinary, now revolved around the porch light and the presence beyond it. Every evening, he approached the door with measured steps, flashlight in hand, heart tight in his chest. The figure was always there, patient, deliberate, unwavering, yet never crossing the threshold. Have you ever felt the weight of someone or something watching you and realized that it does not need to act to make you tremble? That was Ethan now. Each time he flicked the porch light on, he felt the subtle press of awareness, the quiet insistence that he acknowledge it. He began to test it further. Small gestures, a chair slightly moved, the faintest sound on the porch steps, anything to see if it would respond. And sometimes he thought he caught the slightest twitch of shadow, a breath of motion that vanished the instant he focused. It was enough to convince him that he was not imagining it, yet the figure remained inscrutable, patient, eternal. Do you ever wonder if something unseen waits not to harm, but to observe the patterns of your life? Ethan asked himself that question constantly. The presence had become part of his nights, an unshakable rhythm threaded into the darkness, pressing against his perception, shaping how he moved, breathed, and even thought. The nights grew colder, though it was still early autumn. Frost appeared on the lawn, thin and fragile, and yet the porch light shone steadily, illuminating the figure waiting just beyond. Ethan could feel the cold not as temperature, but as tension pressing through the air, a quiet force that weighed on his chest. He whispered into the night, "Why are you here?" But the figure did not answer. It simply waited, patient as stone, deliberate as shadow. Have you ever spoken to the unseen, knowing no answer would come, and felt the question linger like smoke in the air? That is how every word Ethan whispered settled into the darkness, heavy with anticipation, yet unclaimed. The pressure of its attention grew with each night. Ethan noticed how his own perception changed. He heard sounds others could not, felt vibrations in the air too subtle for ordinary awareness. The presence seemed to anticipate his movements, each step, each flick of light, each glance toward the window, measured and accounted for. And yet it remained immobile, silent, deliberate. Do you feel the kind of dread that is not sudden, not violent, but slow and deliberate? That's the tension Ethan lived with. It was a dread woven not from action, but from patience, from the subtle insistence that something unseen mattered, that it was watching, and that nothing in the ordinary world could alter it. One night he tried something bolder. He stepped out onto the porch, flashlight sweeping the yard, muscles tense. The figure remained just beyond the light, its shape indistinct, yet impossible to ignore. The human host would lean in here and ask, if you stepped into the unknown, and it waited for you silently, would you retreat or continue? Ethan continued, each step measured, aware of every rustle of leaves, every shift of shadow. He stopped halfway down the steps, chest tight, and spoke again, louder this time. "I see you. I know you're there." Silence answered. The figure did not flinch. It waited. The air around him seemed to thrum with presence, a pressure against perception that made even the quiet rustling of leaves seem like a signal. Do you ever wonder if acknowledging something unseen changes its power, or merely makes you a participant in its rhythm? Ethan wondered. And in that moment, he felt the answer as a cold certainty. Recognition had not diminished it. It had drawn him further into the tension, into the pattern he could not break. The porch light flickered slightly and Ethan froze. Even the smallest change in illumination seemed amplified, a subtle heartbeat in the night. The figure remained, the pressure pressed in, and then, in a way he could not explain, he felt it closer. Not physically, but in the air itself, a presence that threaded through space, through attention, through the mind. Have you ever felt someone's presence without seeing them, so precise it seems to touch your thoughts? That is what Ethan experienced. The yard, the porch, the quiet neighborhood. It all became a stage for a presence that could not be ignored, a being that needed no voice, no motion, no form. Its patience alone was enough to dominate the night. Hours passed. Ethan remained on the porch, flashlight steady, awareness stretched to the breaking point. The night seemed to hold its breath. Every sound was magnified, the faint hum of electricity, the whisper of leaves, the distant rumble of a car on a nearby street. And yet the figure did not move, did not act. It only waited, deliberate, patient, eternal. Do you feel the kind of tension that exists in stillness, in observation, in the quiet insistence of presence? That was Ethan's night. Every small twitch of the shadows, every imperceptible movement in the darkness, every pause in the ordinary rhythm of the world carried weight. He could not escape it, not in the yard, not in his mind, not in the fragile hours before dawn. Eventually he retreated inside, heart pounding, muscles taut, mind alert. The porch light continued its steady glow, and the figure waited beyond it, patient as ever. He locked the door, closed the blinds, yet the pressure remained. In the silence of the house he felt it pressing against him still, as if it existed not just outside, but inside the walls of perception itself. Have you ever sensed a presence that cannot be banished, that waits without action, and yet changes everything you know about your own space, your own perception? Ethan knew it intimately. It was patient, it was deliberate, it was eternal, and it waited. The night ended as it always did. The figure did not move. The porch light remained. The air carried a subtle, insistent weight. Ethan drifted into a fitful sleep, aware that the waiting continued, even beyond dreams, beyond walls, beyond ordinary understanding. And the question lingered softly, threading through the quiet night, unanswerable yet undeniable. If something waits beyond your light, patient and deliberate, would you step forward or wait for it to make the first move? Some presences do not act. Some presences do not speak. They exist in quiet insistence, shaping perception, threading tension into the air, and reminding us that patience can be more terrifying than action. Ethan felt it every night. And in that realization, the world had changed. The house on Elmwood Lane had always seemed ordinary to outsiders. 2 stories, pale siding, a neatly trimmed yard, and a swing set that creaked faintly in the evening breeze. But to Claire, who had just moved in with her brother, it felt different. There was a subtle heaviness in the air, a quiet tension that seemed to seep from the corners of the rooms, from the angles of the windows, from the attic door at the top of the stairs. Have you ever walked into a new place and felt the walls were watching? Claire felt it the moment she stepped across the threshold. Not with eyes, not yet, but with the unmistakable sense that the space itself held a quiet attention, waiting to see what she would do. Boxes were scattered across the living room, their contents half unpacked, the smell of fresh paint lingering faintly beneath the scent of cardboard. She and her brother had agreed to get the bare essentials set up before tackling the attic, which was still sealed with a thin wooden door and a rusty latch. Yet Claire could not ignore it. Every time she passed the staircase, she felt the weight of that upper room pressing down, subtle and insistent, demanding acknowledgement. Do you ever notice a part of a house that seems alive, even though you know it's just wood and nails? That's what the attic felt like, almost breathing in quiet, measured rhythms that set her pulse a little faster, made her shoulders tighten. That first night, she heard a faint creak from above, a step, perhaps, though she was certain no one was home except her and her brother. The sound was so soft she could have imagined it, except that the air itself seemed to carry a tiny shift, a pressure in the silence that made her pause. She asked herself softly, as you might in a quiet house at night. Was it the house settling? Or was someone, or something, up there? The next day, she tried to ignore the feeling, busying herself with unpacking. But every glance at the attic door, every sound of the stairs settling, made her heart tighten. It wasn't fear exactly, it was anticipation, a quiet dread that something unseen was observing, patient and deliberate. By the second night, the feeling became harder to dismiss. Claire could swear she saw movement just beyond the attic door, subtle shadows shifting when the angle of the hall light changed. She would stop, hold her breath, straining to catch a glimpse, but when she stepped closer, nothing moved. The door was solid, the latch unmoved. Yet she felt it, an awareness beyond sight, pressing softly against her perception. Have you ever sensed eyes on you in a room you know is empty? That's the sensation Claire lived with. It wasn't threatening, not yet, but it was patient, deliberate, undeniable. She began keeping a small notebook by her bed, jotting down every sound, every creak, every flicker of shadow. Footsteps that didn't correspond to anything on the floor below. Whispers she could not place. Small taps at the ceiling that seemed almost rhythmic, deliberate. Her brother laughed at first, insisting it was just the house, just old wood, and heating settling in the cold night. Do you ever hope an explanation is ordinary because the alternative is too impossible to consider? Claire felt that hope, but it didn't last. The presence in the attic did not need to speak, did not need to act. Its patience was enough to make every night uneasy. One evening she climbed the narrow staircase, notebook in hand, determined to investigate. The attic door was heavier than she expected, the latch stiff and resistant. As she lifted it, a faint chill seeped out, brushing her skin with a cold that felt alive, almost sentient. She paused, flashlight in hand, the beam trembling slightly as her pulse quickened. Have you ever opened a door expecting emptiness and felt the air itself resist you? That was Claire now. The attic was dark, dense with shadows that seemed to move just beyond her flashlight's reach. She could feel the space watching, waiting, and every instinct screamed for her to retreat. But curiosity, or perhaps the subtle compulsion of the unknown, pushed her forward. She stepped inside, flashlight cutting through the darkness, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spectres. The room was empty, at least physically. Boxes, old furniture, the remnants of previous occupants, but nothing alive. Yet she could feel it, presence, patience, observation. Do you ever realize that the scariest things are not the ones you see, but the ones that exist just beyond perception? Claire felt that truth pressing against her mind, threading through her chest with each careful step. The attic seemed to breathe. Shadows pooled and shifted along the corners, sometimes lengthening unnaturally, sometimes retreating when the light moved. The sense of being observed never wavered. She shivered and asked aloud, "Who's there? What do you want?" Only silence answered, only the quiet insistence that she acknowledge it. And then the first unmistakable sound, a whisper, almost human, almost deliberate, just beyond the threshold of comprehension. She froze, heart hammering, flashlight trembling. It was not loud, not a shout or cry, but precise, intentional. A sound that confirmed what she had known all along. She was not alone. Have you ever heard a whisper in a place you know is empty and felt the weight of attention behind it? That whisper threaded into Claire's awareness, wrapping the attic in a quiet, undeniable presence. She retreated, closing the attic door slowly, listening to the soft echoes of the unknown settling back into silence. Every night after, the sensation returned, the feeling of eyes, of patience, of something deliberate, just beyond sight. Claire began to note patterns, tiny consistencies in the sounds, the movement of shadows, the shifts in air that preceded them. By the end of that first week, she understood something unsettling. The attic waited. It did not need to move. It did not need to speak. Its presence, patient and deliberate, was enough to make ordinary nights feel impossible to ignore. And so, Claire adjusted her life around it, sleeping lightly, listening closely, observing, documenting. Every step, every glance at the attic door, every creak of stairs or whisper of shadow carried the quiet tension of awareness. Have you ever realized that some things wait, not to frighten, but to exist? That their patience alone is enough to shape your world? Claire understood. And in the quiet darkness of Elmwood Lane, the attic waited, patient, deliberate, eternal. The nights grew heavier, and the attic no longer felt like an empty room. Claire could sense it now, not just in the corner of her vision, or the subtle chill in the air, but as a weight pressing across the entire house. The shadows seemed denser, the quiet stretched taut, and every step on the stairs carried the hum of anticipation. Have you ever felt the air itself tighten, as if the world around you is holding its breath, waiting for something unseen? That's how Claire felt each night, each sound magnified, every creak or whisper amplified into significance. She tried to continue her life, unpacking, arranging the house, keeping her brother from noticing the growing dread that pulled at her chest. But the presence was patient. It waited for acknowledgement, for attention, and refused to be ignored. The attic door seemed to pulse with it, an invisible heartbeat she could feel, even when the rest of the house was still. Then came the first unmistakable movement. Claire was in the kitchen pouring a cup of tea when a faint sound from upstairs caught her attention. A step, light, deliberate, and measured. Her heart leapt. She froze, cup in hand, listening as the house returned to silence. It was subtle, almost too soft to register, but unmistakable. Do you ever hear a sound and instantly know it wasn't just the house settling, that it had intention behind it? That is what pressed against Claire's awareness now. That night, she climbed the stairs slowly, flashlight cutting a narrow path through the darkness. Each step creaked, announcing her presence, and she felt it. The attic, waiting, watching, patient as ever. Shadows shifted at the edge of the light, bending unnaturally. And then, from the corner of her vision, movement. A flicker. A lean. Something just beyond the flashlight's reach, deliberate and precise. Have you ever caught a shadow moving and when you focus it's gone, but the sense of awareness remains? Claire was learning the unnerving truth of that sensation. She stepped closer to the attic door, hand on the latch, pulse hammering. A whisper echoed faintly through the ceiling, almost human, almost intelligible. Her flashlight trembled in her grip, casting fleeting shapes across the walls. It was deliberate, patient, observing her reaction without moving, without breaking its rhythm. Do you ever ask yourself if acknowledging something unseen empowers it, or merely entangles you further? Claire asked herself this constantly, but she could not turn away. She opened the attic door just enough to peer inside. Dust motes floated in the beam of the flashlight, old boxes and furniture scattered. Empty. And yet she felt it, closer, more deliberate. The air pressed against her, the shadows seemed alive, bending unnaturally. The presence was patient, and patience carried weight. That night, she lingered longer than she should have, trying to trace the edges of the invisible, to name the unnameable. Each sound, each creak of the floorboards, each whisper of air was a signal, a pattern, a reminder that she was observed. Have you ever realized that some fears aren't about what can harm you, but about what can simply exist, patient and deliberate, in your world? That is what Claire faced. Days passed, and the pattern solidified. The attic presence moved with purpose, but never crossed thresholds. It existed just beyond sight, shaping the house, threading tension into her perception, teaching her that patience could terrify more than action. Every night she approached the attic, the air thickened, shadows deepened, and the sense of being watched grew sharper. Then the first anomaly appeared. Something tangible. A small box, previously stacked against the far wall, shifted slightly as if nudged by unseen hands. Claire's breath caught. She knew she had not moved it. Every muscle tensed, every nerve alert. The presence had acknowledged her, subtly, deliberately, without crossing the boundary. Do you ever notice that even the smallest actions by an unseen force can change your perception entirely? Claire felt that shift. Her world had contracted to the attic, to the porch of shadows, to the quiet insistence of a presence that refused to be ignored. Night after night, she documented everything. Footsteps, whispers, shifts in air, shadows moving against logic. And always the patient wait, waiting for acknowledgement. It did not attack. It did not speak. Its patience was its dominion. Have you ever realized that the unseen does not need to act to command fear? That awareness alone can be a form of power? Claire lived that truth with every heartbeat, every step, every glance at the attic door. One night, braver, or perhaps compelled by some unseen force, she stepped fully into the attic. Flashlight in hand, she scanned every corner. The room remained physically unchanged, yet the air carried presence, attention, and deliberation. Shadows shifted at the edges of her vision. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "I see you. I know you're there." And in that stillness the response came, not as movement, not as sound, but as a pressure, a certainty, a presence that filled the space. Claire understood. It did not need form, it did not need voice, it did not need action. Its patient awareness alone was enough to dominate the night, to shape perception, to change her world. Do you ever wonder if the most terrifying things are not those that move toward you, but those that simply exist, patient and deliberate, waiting for acknowledgement? That was Claire's reality now. She stepped back, closing the attic door slowly, heart hammering, awareness stretched to the breaking point. Shadows seemed to linger, pressing against the doorway, the floor, the walls. The presence remained, patient, deliberate, and undeniably aware. Every night it would continue, and she could do nothing but observe, anticipate, and respect the quiet insistence of something that refused to be ignored. The tension threaded through every room, every corner of the house, shaping her perception, heightening her senses, embedding the patience of the attic into her nights. And with each passing evening, Claire realized a chilling truth. Some presences do not need to move. They wait, and in waiting, they dominate. The house watched back now in a way Claire could no longer ignore. It had stopped being merely a place where things happened and had become an active presence in her life, an anatomy of quiet intentions stitched into floorboards and rafters. Nights were no longer intervals to sleep through. They were an exercise in attention. Every small noise was a letter in a language she had not agreed to learn, and yet somehow she was being taught. Have you ever felt a place change the rules around you? Where the ordinary laws of room and movement give way to something else, slower, older, more patient? Claire lived there. The attic had shifted from a space on a blueprint to a consciousness that pressed against the walls of her every day. It did not announce itself with fury or spectacle. It moved like a tide, insistent and inevitable. It began with the sound of breathing. Not the wheeze of an appliance or the shallow draft of a window. This was cadence, measured and slow, a breath that seemed larger than any single room. Claire was awake for it in the dead hour, the clock a small, pale thing on her nightstand. She lay very still, listening, feeling as if the house itself exhaled. The breath came from above, from the attic, and it filled her with a peculiar vertigo. The sensation that the house had inhaled years of people and exhaled the memory right back into the ceiling. Do you ever hear a sound and know immediately it is meant for you? That's how the breathing felt. Personal, directed, as if the house were learning the contours of her attention and then shaping its quiet gestures to meet it. Claire slid from the bed and moved through the dark with the kind of care that makes small sounds disappear. The hallway felt like a throat. Shoes sounded too loud. She placed her hand on the attic door and found the wood warm, as though something had been leaning against it, listening back. She began to dream the attic awake. Dreams were not the soft, shapeless things they had been. They included the angle of the attic window, a sliver of moonlight falling across a forgotten trunk, a pressure in the ribs that matched the breathing she had heard. She woke certain she had been watched in the dream, and certain the watching continued when her eyes opened. The boundary between sleep and waking thinned until she could no longer trust where one ended and the other began. Have you ever woken with the impression you were not alone, though the room appeared empty? Claire's mornings tasted of that impression. She would stand in the kitchen pouring coffee and feel the attic pressing down like weather. Items misplaced themselves, as if nudged with invisible fingers. An envelope shifted on the table. A scarf draped across a chair had been subtly rearranged. These were small violences, easily dismissed if you wanted to be practical, but when they repeated, they became proof in the slow arithmetic of irritation and wonder. One night, the movement escalated. The old trunk beneath the eaves slid a matter of inches, an impossible distance for a thing that had been still for decades. Claire found it at dawn. The wood scraped along the floorboards, as though pushed by a hand she could not see. The scuff marked the floor like a punctuation. She circled it, flashlight trembling, and for the first time she felt the attic's attention as a directed thing, not merely present, but interacting with the world below. Why do we catalogue small changes as proof? Because terror is often cumulative. A single creak might be a settling board, a shifted trunk, a draft. But a series of small, deliberate acts begins to form a pattern, a grammar of the uncanny. Claire understood the grammar now. The attic watched, it breathed, it moved. It was learning how to be present in ways that the living easily recognized and the living could not easily answer. Have you ever tried to speak to the thing that watches you? The next night she did. Standing at the top of the stairs, she pressed her palms flat to the attic door and said very quietly, "I see you. Stop." Her voice was small in the house. For a moment only the house answered, pipes, a distant dog, the low grumble of the heater, and she felt foolish. Then from above a sound responded, not speech, not language, but a series of taps, uneven at first, then forming a slow cadence, like someone testing syllables one by one. The taps vibrated through the wood and into her chest. That little communication reoriented everything. It was not a reply so much as acknowledgement. The attic had noticed not only her presence, but the fact that she sought to define the engagement. The taps felt deliberate, intimate, as if it were trying the mechanics of contact. Claire, astonished and terrified, realized she had crossed a threshold. The attic had perceived her as an interlocutor. Do you ever realize that addressing the unknown changes your relationship to it? Once acknowledged, it no longer belonged to the category of accidental noises. It became something that could, in some small way, choose to respond. The next days were the hardest. The house was no longer a passive stage. It had become a participant that demanded recognition. Family photos fell forward from a shelf without explanation. The stair rail bore tiny, fresh scratches as though someone had dragged a fingernail along it. The attic window held the faint impression of something like a palm print on the inside of the glass. No dust, no smudge, but the negative shape of fingers. These were not random. They were gestures of intent, a slow assertion of presence. Claire began to keep a recorder within the attic itself. She climbed the narrow steps, flashlight trembling, and set the device on the trunk's lid. The attic was colder than the house below, a surprising dry cold that seemed to settle into bones. She left the recorder running, the little red light blinking into the dark like an eye. For the first few hours it registered the expected sounds, the wind, the sigh of rafters. Then, at 2:13 a.m., there was a sound the recorder would later identify as not only breathing, but also the thinnest of voices, a syllable, almost a name, folded into the air. When she played it back, the waveform showed a tiny, regular pattern superimposed on the ambient noise, a quiet rhythm like fingertips against wood. Have you ever listened to a recording of your fear and felt it become something else, object, trace, testimony? The playback converted the night's terror into data, and yet data does not soothe the animal part of us that feels watched. The syllable on the tape did not resolve into any name she knew. It shifted in timbre when she slowed it, now a whisper, now a thread of static that shaped itself into vowels. The more she listened, the more she believed it was both a practice and a call. As if the attic rehearsed sounds like a creature learning language, or a person humming under their breath to keep from being silent. That very night, the hair on her arms stood with a different kind of urgency. Claire awoke to the unmistakable feeling of weight at the edge of her bed. Not on top of her body, but in the air beside her, dense and cold, a presence leaning into the thin space of her night. In the shadow, the lamp cast across the wall, she thought she saw a shape gather, as if breath condensed into form. She kept still, mind rocking between the desire to flee and the deeper need to understand. The presence did not touch her. It merely hovered like an accusation and a promise all at once. Have you ever lain perfectly still and let fear trace your thoughts like a slow, certain hand? That night, Claire let it. She whispered into the darkness a question that had burned longer than any other. What do you want? The answer, when it came, was not a sentence. It was a pressure, a sense of being measured, judged, catalogued. It felt as if the attic were reading the ledger of her life, habits, small cruelties, unspoken things. The house did not speak with words. It spoke with attention, and attention can be invasive. From that point, privacy itself seemed compromised. The attic's presence learned where she hid small things, how she wrapped a letter, the cadence of her breath. It catalogued the mundane and the private alike, architecture becoming a method of surveillance. The scratches on the stair rail deepened. An old childhood toy she had packed away returned to the middle of the living room, positioned so that it faced the stairs as if it were an emissary. It was a deliberate act of placement, a demonstration that the attic could reach into the lower house and arrange objects to be seen. Do you ever feel observed not for your safety, but for the spectacle of being observed? The difference matters. This presence watched like a collector who catalogued not to protect, but to keep. The knowledge stung. It made Claire angry and horrified in equal measure. Her anger, however, only seemed to sharpen the presence. Objects shifted more frequently. The voice on the recorder accrued more syllables, and the breathing deepened into a slow, ancestral rhythm that made her bones ache. Neighbours began to notice, too. Her brother complained of cold spots walking through the hallway, of being watched in a way that made the hair on his neck stand up. He found scratches on his forearm he could not explain. The community, which had once found the house charming, began to regard it with a soft, cautious distance. People spoke in lowered tones and avoided the driveway at night. The house had become a story, and stories attract attention that sometimes solidifies into reality. Claire tried to leave, to stay with a friend, to sleep elsewhere. But even away from the house she carried its imprimatur. She would wake in the guest room with palms damp, certain the attic had not released its curiosity. The presence had somehow followed the map of her life, stitched itself to memory. She could not escape by distance, only by a kind of denial she could not sustain. And then the night when everything changed. It began with a knock, 3 soft, deliberate raps that came from nowhere she could point to and everywhere she could feel. They spoke the rhythm of something older. They were not the attic's gentle taps. These were coded, measured, as if the house learned that rhythm and borrowed it. Claire heard them through the walls, in the bones of the house, and they vibrated with recognition across the neighborhood, an echo that seemed to call other things to attention. Have you ever heard a sound that rearranges memory? Those 3 knocks did. They threaded the attic's presence into the same lattice as the knocks people sometimes spoke of in other places, an insistence on being remembered, a signature of attention that could travel like an infection across houses and years. The knocks were not malicious, they were not promised to be. They were, however, a call, a practiced, communal insistence that made the skin rise and the heart recalibrate. Claire stood at the top of the stairs, hand on the banister, eyes fixed on the attic door. The house, which had once been merely rooms and light, had become a sentience that could call and be called. In that moment she understood with a clarity that brought tears to her eyes. Whatever watched from the attic was part of something larger, a slow network of attention that spanned beyond her house, a patient architecture of watching that connected to other nights, other knocks, other small attentions that refused to die. What do you do with that knowledge? You choose, in the instant you are given, whether to stay and be catalogued or to walk away and let the story continue without you. Claire hesitated, listening to the 3 knocks echo as if through bone. The attic's breathing matched it now, a tide of sound synchronized with the raps. The house had become a kind of instrument, and she was both its audience and its note. She made a choice that might not have been a choice at all. She walked up the stairs, opened the attic door, and stepped into the full measure of what waited there. The flashlight's beam trembled, catching dust and the faint outline of something that was not quite a shadow and not quite a figure. It acknowledged her with a sound that was at once a syllable and a patient, slow intake of breath. In the silence, Claire felt catalogued, understood, and exposed. Have you ever stepped into a thing that had long prepared for your arrival? The attic had. It did not move to harm. It did not need to. Its patient attention, its accumulation of small acts had already reshaped the world into a place that answered to it. Claire stood in the attic and felt the house look at her in a new way, no longer merely curious, but seeing. And then, very quietly, as if in a courtesy one offers a guest, the attic released a sound that might have been a name. It draped that syllable across the rafters like a ribbon. Claire heard it, and inexplicably felt a kinship with it, the sense that something ancient and patient had finally been noticed by a living mind, and that in being noticed, it had changed. The change was not rescue, it was documentation, registration. She found herself both terrified and oddly consoled. She had not been erased by attention, she had been recorded. Outside, the night closed, indifferent and full. The house settled, only now it settled differently. A new ledger had been made. The attic's presence would continue its work, patient and deliberate. Claire had become another line in its careful book. And somewhere beyond the house, the pattern of knocks and patient watching threaded outward, indifferent to human comfort, persistent as weather. Have you ever felt measured, not by numbers but by attention? It is a small terror and a strange honor. The attic had done both to Claire. She turned off the flashlight, stood motionless, and listened as the breathing slowed. The house was quiet. For a moment, it seemed that the watching had shifted into something like understanding, a recognition that neither demanded nor forgave. The attic had done its slow work. It had catalogued and observed, rearranged and whispered, and in the quiet way of persistent things it had taught Claire the grammar of attention. Standing in that upper room, the dust motes trembling in her flashlight's beam, she realized the house had not been waiting to hurt her. It had been waiting to be answered. Whether that answer would be kindness or surrender, it did not care. It catalogued, and then it continued. Have you ever felt that by simply looking, you change the thing you look at? Claire understood that truth in the marrow. The attic, once an anonymous weight at the top of the stairs, had become a presence with the patience to learn the shape of her life. It watched, not out of malice so much as method. In the hush that followed her arrival, she felt measured, counted, placed in a ledger of attention she could not read but clearly existed. She stayed a long time that night, longer than she had ever intended. Her breath synchronized to the slow exhale that seemed to come from the rafters themselves. The syllables the attic had practiced, those fragments of sound she had caught on tape, unraveled themselves into something softer in the dark, like someone testing the pronunciation of a forgotten name. Claire listened, and in a voice that barely disturbed the still air, she answered with another sound. Not a word perhaps, but a small, deliberate sound meant to tell the attic, she noticed. What happens when you answer a thing that waits? Does acknowledgement change power into companionship, or does it only register you as another specimen to watch? Claire could not know, but she felt in that listening something shift. The pressure in the air lightened a hair. The breathing slowed a fraction. The trunk's scuff marks seemed less urgent. The scratches on the stair rail remained, but they read now like notes rather than threats, annotations in a book rather than wounds. Outside, The neighborhood spun its slow night, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional dog barking, the small mechanics of life continuing without knowledge of the tiny ledger being written inside a single house. Yet inside, in those minutes, a different economy had come into being, attention paid and attention received. It was not tidy or moral, it was simply real. Have you ever wondered if the world keeps a record of those who notice it? The attic seemed to keep such a record. It did not confide, it only registered. Claire, who had once feared and then catalogued and finally conversed, felt oddly less afraid. Not safe, there was no grand safety to be claimed, but acknowledged. The house had noticed her, and in being noticed, she had become legible to it. She slept that night, not easily, but with a sense that something had been set down between her and the house. The presence did not leave, it did not promise comfort. It simply resumed its patient watch, the breathing now a softer rhythm underneath the ordinary noises of a house at rest. In the morning, small things had returned to their places. The toy remained where it had been positioned, the trunk showed no fresh movement. The world had resumed its orderly pace, but with a new annotation. Claire's name, her visit, the night she stood in the attic, and answered, "Have you ever carried an event in silence and found it expand inside you, unannounced?" The memory of that night threaded through Claire's days like a thin cord she could not cut. She found herself more attentive to small things. The way dust lay on a windowsill, the angle of light on a chair, the way a neighbour paused at his fence. She felt both changed and marked. The attic's ledger was no longer only in the house, it had migrated into her perception, softening some edges, sharpening others. Neighbours spoke less and watched more. Her brother, who had once laughed at creaks and drafts, began to lock doors with a careful hand, and to glance up the stairs before going to bed. People who had once written the house off as charming and ordinary now left it a slow birth of caution. Stories, once told in passing over mailboxes and coffee, congealed into a pattern, an attic that watched, a house that catalogued, a woman who had answered. The local paper never wrote it up. Some things remain better, as small, private liabilities of attention. Months passed. The attic did not stop. It kept its quiet vigil, accumulating the record of life. After argument, the rustle of newspapers, the quiet of late-night tears. It's unreasonable to say it learned kindness. It was not that simple, but the house had adapted to being seen. Its acts of rearrangement lessened in their cruelty and became more deliberate in their language, an object placed to be found, a small sound at a time someone most needed then to wake. Claire learned to read those signs as a new alphabet, not to command the house but to converse with it. There were nights, still, when old fears returned with the wind. Sometimes the scratches on the rail would deepen, as if the house were reminding her that agency lay not with her alone. Sometimes the air would compress into that old weight, and she would wake with the certainty someone had leaned in close to catalogue her sleep. Those were the nights she would speak softly into the dark, the human host question inherent in her voice. "Are you still there?" And the answer came as the faintest of taps, an acknowledgement that was neither welcome nor refusal, merely documentation. And then, one autumn evening, a sound threaded through the town. 3 knocks in the dark, precise and slow. They were not the attic's soft taps, but a rhythm that matched something wider, a call you could feel in the bones. Neighbours heard them as they closed curtains or turned the porch light on. People who had never spent a night in Claire's house paused and felt them minute in common, as if the town itself had synchronized to an invisible clock. The knocks passed like a tide, leaving houses and yards with the residue of attention. Do you ever think about the ways small patterns cross large distances, how a rhythm in one house can echo in another, uninvited and unstoppable? The attic's presence, cataloguing and patient, seemed to sit inside that larger lattice. Claire felt it, not as fear now, but as a kind of belonging to a strange architecture of watching. She had become, in the attic's ledger, a node. That realization was both humbling and oddly consoling. She was not alone in being observed. Time, as it does, erodes certain urgencies. Seasons changed. The house needed paint. The widow down the street sold her hens and moved in with her daughter. The stories softened at kitchen tables. Some neighbours spoke of the attic with a shrug. Some kept the old caution close. Claire lived under the house's attention and in small ways learned to live alongside it. She still kept a notebook, still recorded the soft syllables in the night, still sometimes woke to the feeling of being catalogued, but she also learned the quiet craft of attention, how to notice without becoming consumed, how to answer without expecting an answer. What do you do when a thing watches patiently and refuses to be anything but itself? You either move away, and the ledger continues without you, or you stay, and you become part of the book. Claire chose to remain. Not out of bravery in the cinematic sense, but out of an acceptance that some things in the world require witnessing more than solving. Sometimes bearing witness is the closest thing to understanding. On a late afternoon, years after she first heard the faint creak that led her upstairs, Claire climbed the stairs one last time in a way that felt ceremonial. She placed a small object in the centre of the attic's floor, a paper crane folded with hands that had slowly learned patience. She left it there, and with the softest of voices said, "I remember." The attic answered with a single, delicate tap. So slight it might have been accidental if anyone else had heard it. To Claire, it read like agreement. Have you ever felt the relief of having a ledger closed, not with finality, but with recognition? The attic did not stop watching. It never would. But the act of placing that small paper crane into its space changed the ledger's tone. It was no longer only a list of curiosities and unsettled items. It had become a record that included acknowledgement, exchange, and, perhaps, a measure of mutual regard. The house stood as houses do, still weathered, sometimes indifferent. The attic remained its quiet archive, patient as ever, keeping its slow breaths and its small syllables. People would still speak of Claire's night, of the taps and the trunk that moved, but the story's edge dulled into something quieter. A life lived alongside an inscrutable attention. For Claire, the presence in the attic became a continuous, strange companion, part observation, part registry, part the world's stubborn insistence that some things, once noticed, do not vanish. And as you listen now in any quiet room you occupy, the human host question settles in the air between one breath and the next. If a place pays attention to you, are you changed by being noticed? Claire had been changed. Not rescued, not punished, not freed, simply altered, catalogued, and made legible to a patient architecture that kept its records in the rafters. The house continues, the attic continues. The taps return now and then, a memorandum in wood and air. And if you ever find yourself pausing at the top of your own stairs, feeling the faint pressure of another attention, remember that to notice is sometimes its own kind of answer. The porch light's gone cold now, no more footsteps, only the sound of your own room again. The same walls, same hum, same small safety that comes after a long night of listening. If you're still here, that means you stayed through every knock, every shadow, every silence. That's the kind of listener who keeps this channel alive. So, do our quiet check again. Slow breath in, loosen your jaw, Thumb on the table, click the quiet key. Tell me in the comments which detail lingered with you tonight. Was it the knock that followed the couple through the woods? The tapping outside the glass when no one was there? Or the whisper that almost sounded like your own name? New calm horror files arrive most nights. Wait until the video fades to black before subscribing, so the next story finds you when the room's ready. I'll keep the lamp low and the world small, just enough to see what's still moving outside. Good night, listener. Stay still and keep your eyes on the window for one more breath.